The International Energy Agency released a net zero by 2050 scenario earlier this year, and it really got a lot of attention because it showed how we can get to net zero, but it also demonstrated how difficult that's going to be and where huge investments need to take place, where governments have to beef up policy, that sort of thing. Well, as it turns out, Canada doesn't have its own net zero by 2050. The agency that would be responsible, the Canadian energy regulator, hasn't done it. And I'm going to talk to economist Nic Rivers, who's at the University of Ottawa, about why that is and what we should do. So welcome to the interview, Nic.
Thanks very much, Markham. It's nice to be here.
Now, you and some co-authors wrote an article entitled "A Critical Step in the Net Zero Energy Transition is Modeling the Future We're Aiming For." Came out in this month's Policy Options magazine. So you've looked at this issue. What is the CER modeling now?
Right. So the CER models a number of things, but the report that we were looking at is called Canada's Energy Future, and it's kind of their flagship report. And it basically is their effort to understand future trends in energy markets and how, particularly Canadian energy markets. And they are trying to give insight to investors or to governments about where the big trends in energy are pointing. And to do that, they have an in-house model that they use to predict what the future Canadian economy and Canadian energy economy is likely to look like. And unlike the recent IEA report, which is kind of doing the same thing globally, the Canadian energy regulator, which used to be the National Energy Board, gone through a name change, the Canadian energy regulator has to figure out, what climate policies look like. And they have two scenarios that underpin this report. They have a reference case scenario in which they assume that all energy policies are fixed, climate policies are fixed, they don't change going forward. And they have what they call an evolving policy scenario, in which they assume that energy policy kind of gradually evolves towards lower carbon. But neither of these get the Canadian economy or model the global economy getting anywhere near net zero by 2050, which is the stated policy goal of Canada and many other countries in the world. And so effectively, the Canadian energy regulator is saying, here's what we think the future Canadian economy looks like, and it's not a net zero economy. It's actually, an economy that's at odds with our stated policy goals of transforming our energy system. So our statement was that it gives kind of misleading advice to policymakers and to investors.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because governments do pay attention to these kinds of studies. So do we know why the Canadian Energy Regulator hasn't modeled net zero by 2050?
I don't think we really have good evidence about what the internal dynamics are in the CER that has led them to not model a net zero by 2050 as either one of the scenarios they model or the central case scenario they model, since it's the stated federal goal. They do have some, they do point towards net zero scenarios in their modeling report, but they're not really fleshed out in the same way as their central case scenarios. So I don't want to speculate about what the political dynamics are in the taking place in the Canadian Energy Regulator, but I do think it's important that they bring forward a net zero scenario so that investors have a good sense of what the world might look like going forward to mid-century under the stated policy goal of the federal government.
Yeah, there are probably viewers sitting, watching this and wondering why this is important. And I think you have to point to the IEA's net zero by 2050 analysis and how that changed the global conversation around net zero by 2050. I think it has led to a greater commitment by some countries to net zero. And there's a better discussion, I think, around how we're going to get there, what government policies are required, where investment is required. It really ratcheted up the quality and the conversation. That's my take on it. Would you agree with that, Nic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it really sets expectations around the future we can expect that's consistent with the goal we're headed towards. If the federal government says, we're going to hit net zero by 2050, and our main forecaster or energy regulator saying, well, here's what the energy future looks like, and it's full of oil and gas, that is not consistent with a net zero by 2050 scenario, well, that's providing pretty mixed signals or misleading signals to investors and to policymakers that are trying to plan investments and policies going forward. So I really think, in the name of consistency, in the name of modeling the future we want to see, and setting the expectations for investors correctly, it's important for the regulator to be modeling this net zero scenario. Of course, they can't figure out exactly what the future is going to look like, but I think it's important that they model a scenario that's indicative, like the IEA did, of what a future low carbon emission society might look like.
Well, let's give our viewers an example of some modeling that has been very useful in Canada. And I'm thinking of Jason Dion's study about decarbonization pathways for Canada that came out earlier this year. And in it, he talked about all of the energy technologies like, hydro and wind and solar and nuclear and on and on. And he made a very important contribution to the public conversation by describing safe bet technologies, so electric vehicles, wind and solar batteries, and wildcard technologies. And those are ones that have promise, but we probably won't see them till the 2030s at the earliest. Small modular nuclear reactors, hydrogen and all. And his argument was that Canada should be putting resources, a lot of resources, into safe bets while still funding and developing wildcards that we will need down the road. I thought that was a really important contribution, and it's an example of how what the Canadian Energy Regulator could do, how it can contribute to policymaking and the way Canadians think and talk about, our energy future.
Agreed. So this is the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices report that you're referring to, and their report looks at, as you say, what the Canadian society might look like as we get towards net zero by mid-century. And that's exactly the kind of report that I think that the CER should be putting forward. I think another example of where this could be useful is in thinking about future oil and gas investments. So this is obviously something that's really important in this country. And the current CER report is basically a business as usual report. What happens if the policies basically stay the way they are today, and if the global prices for oil and gas stay they are the way today? They're not consistent with a transition of either the Canadian economy or the global economy towards net zero. So if investors are planning their investments based on a future of high oil and gas prices that are inconsistent with a low carbon future, they could end up with stranded assets. They could end up producing a whole bunch of oil and gas that the world may not need. And so I think, in addition to thinking about, what future climate policies we might need to be implementing, it's also important for the Canadian economy to get an accurate forecast of what future energy demands are likely to look like globally. And right, the forecast that the CER is putting out is not consistent with a world achieving low emissions.
Well, let's talk about something specific. I'm glad you brought up oil and gas because I did a video column a couple of weeks ago about this. Between now and 2030, the Environment and Climate Change Canada, the ECCC, forecasts that the emissions from oil and gas, which are 193 megatons a year now, and that's the biggest emitter that we have in the country. Oil and gas production will increase by 1.4 million barrels of oil equivalent a day by the end of the decade. And the emissions from that sector by then will be 194 megatons a year. So this question has to be addressed because we're never going to meet our climate targets if we don't get oil and gas emissions down. And there's our Environment Department basically saying, based on what we see going forward, they're actually rising slightly.
Right. I completely agree with you. This is the elephant in the room in Canadian climate change policy. The reason our emissions have not declined, despite policies to reduce our emissions, is the fact that any reductions we've had have been offset by growth in the oil and gas sector. And so I agree completely that we have to figure out how to address this. I think the federal election recently, the Liberals were elected partly on a platform of capping and reducing oil and gas emissions going forward. And I think the ECCC, the Environment Canada analysis that you looked at won't have included that very recent commitment. And so I think, thinking about this sector's future, it's going to be important partly to think about what the global demand for oil and gas is going to look like in the CER report, but it's also going to be important for us to be thinking about what future Canadian climate policy looks like. And that has to include now recognition that the Liberals have been elected on a platform of capping and reducing oil and gas sector emissions going forward.
Nic, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks for having me on. That's great.